In the middle of tremendous darkness and personal tragedy, false lights are trying to guide us, and they can bring shipwreck. We must be focused on God's pathways and His light in the storms of life. Christ is the light of navigation. Hello, and welcome to the Light of Navigation and the God Stories. My name is Marguerite Lever-Woodall, and I'm an author, speaker, and your host. I write short stories about real-life, supernatural encounters with God, and I love to explore what it is, what it means to follow God's pathways. In this 10th episode of the God Stories, called God, the Van, and the Property Tax, I learned that God can bring financial help through unfortunate mishaps we think are just terrible. He's also a top-notch lawyer or advocate when it's needed. You don't want to meet God in a courtroom. Come and join me in the adventures of the God Stories and experience the encounters with the goodness of God even in the middle of our life's storms. God can meet a need in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it can seem crazy in our way of viewing things. We have preconceived ideas about how God operates. God's not crazy, of course, but when He comes through for us, it can be through unconventional events or circumstances. Years ago, I took a step of faith financially in divorcing a second husband that had basically abandoned my son and I. I was afraid, terrified is more like it, of the loss of my husband's income and trying to make it by myself with my 12-year-old son in tow. For 5 years after the divorce, I struggled with trying to start a floral shop business and build a customer base to generate some sort of income. It was tough. My son and I literally lived from shop order to shop order financially. There were many challenges. At one point, I found myself sitting in a judge's chamber at the local city courthouse. A hospital's lawyer was claiming I had failed to pay a large hospital debt. When it was my turn to speak to the accusations, I placed a large handful of carefully folded receipts, 2 years' worth, on the table. Not one payment had been missed. The look on the lawyer's face was priceless. It was obvious he was stunned and embarrassed. When the receipts were totaled, I had actually overpaid them $400 or $500. The hospital had never sent a monthly billing, though I had asked for one several times. I had sent the payments in anyway, faithfully. The judge took one look at the stack of receipts and dismissed the case against me with a judgment satisfied being declared. A week later, I was applying for a small personal loan at my bank to meet various basic needs. The bank's loan officer asked for the judgment satisfied documentation from the court hearing. What I did not know was that the hospital debt was still on my credit report. The bank had checked my credit, of course, and the supposed bad debt listed had not yet been removed. I didn't have the court document in my possession. No one told me that I needed to pick up a copy of the judgment satisfied when I left the courthouse that day. When I contacted the city about the paperwork, I was told that the hospital's lawyer had taken it instead. Of course, my next step was calling to ask for the return of the paperwork that belonged to me from that lawyer. But the request was refused. His refusal to return it to me was one of the most helpless moments I have ever felt. Legally, it wasn't his to take. I was crestfallen, angry, and discouraged. I wondered briefly if the attorney had taken it to spite me, because I had embarrassed him in front of the presiding judge that day. How would I fight this lawyer for the document? I certainly had no money to hire my own attorney to pursue it. I desperately needed the loan, and the judgment-satisfied document was the key. The bank's loan officer listened compassionately as I told her why I could not produce the documentation they requested. The bank's hands were tied without the judgment satisfied, and there could be no loan. I remember at home later that afternoon crying out to God for justice in a passionate prayer. To this day, I can recall where I was standing in the hallway of my home at that moment, all these years later. I reminded him that the biblical scriptures spoke of him as a God of justice and an advocate for the widow and orphan. Ironically, the word advocate is another word for lawyer. I had declared that the hospital had their lawyer, but I had my own, Jesus. 2 days later, the loan officer from the bank called me. I was informed that on my behalf, and of their own volition, the bank's lawyers had contacted the hospital's attorney. They had demanded the judgment-satisfied document be returned, and threatened legal action if it wasn't. It was returned post-haste that same afternoon following the bank lawyer's phone call. The loan officer now had possession of it and asked me to pick it up at my convenience. In addition, I was told the loan I had asked for would be granted. It was an incredible feeling of joy and elation to know that God moved on my behalf so wonderfully. I had prayed and cried out for something in prayer that truthfully, deep down, I hadn't expected to come to pass. And it was answered so quickly. I remembered God's presence surrounding me in His love as I stood there listening to the answer to my prayer. God had advocated for me swiftly and powerfully. I was shocked by the truth and action that God is an advocate or lawyer of the best kind as described in the Bible. It was truly now an experienced reality, not just words on paper in the scriptures. Some needed or hoped for justice in our lives seems to come slowly or looks like it's been delayed long term. I was learning that there are times when it can come through quickly. It's an incredible feeling to know He cares about the injuries or harm we go through in this life. In the fall of that year, the propane tank for our trailer home had finally approached the empty point on the gauge. Once again, there was no financial means to have it refilled. It was a $250 cost. I could not cook without it, and heat was needed for the approaching winter. I had heard stories of how the Lord would multiply food and resources for others when there was not enough on hand. I'd known some people who'd had it happen to them. With that in mind, and in desperation, I placed my hands on that propane tank and prayed and asked God to multiply and keep it going until I had the funds to buy more. In addition, the following spring, I received a notice that my property taxes were past due. There was a deadline for the payment. It was a $650 tax bill, and I was broke and facing the possible loss of our home and land. My deceased husband and I had purchased it just after we married 9 years previously. It was a small half-acre parcel of land with a large garden. That garden fed an entire neighborhood at one point and was graced with tall, beautiful pines and fruit trees. I spent many hours keeping the yard meticulously groomed and the garden weeded and watered. I had poured my heart and soul into the land after my husband passed. The hard work kept me busy as I grieved. It was now literally the very last day to pay those taxes. And there I was again, crying out to God in prayer as I drove my van through town, running multiple errands that same day. I prayed passionately and loudly as I sat at the next stoplight and poured my heart out, asking Him to meet the financial need. "20 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of the local feed store as an elderly woman backed out to leave. Not seeing me enter the parking area, she struck my van on the passenger side as she pulled out. Up in arms and upset, she quickly came over to me to apologize, as I was wondering what else could go wrong with my day and my life. The woman began talking about a teenage son that her and her husband had put on their auto insurance policy recently. He had been involved in an accident, which in turn had caused their insurance premiums to skyrocket. Would I defer calling in an accident report and take a cash payment instead for any repairs? She asked. Normally, I would have refused and insisted on a report. This was my floral delivery vehicle, and how it looked mattered. As I stood there looking at the dent, I realized it was very small and barely visible. I decided then that the best route was to take her offer, especially for her sake. I felt badly for her. Besides, I thought to myself, I could use the money instead. With her phone number in hand, I drove to 2 different auto repair shops and chose the lowest estimate. She was greatly relieved and promptly paid me in cash that same day. What was the repair estimate amount, you might ask? It was $650. The exact amount needed to pay my property taxes before the end of the day. By the way, the propane tank kept working for 2 additional months, with the gauge on empty the entire time, until I had the funds to refill it. We all receive dents or dings in this life, and shortfalls, they come and go. Some of them are large and some are small, but they can sure pay off when God is present and orchestrating it all. And we know with great confidence that God, who is deeply concerned about us, causes all things to work together as a plan for good for those who love Him, to those who are called according to His purpose. Romans 8, verse 28. Thank you for taking time to listen to my story. If this podcast would bring encouragement and hope to someone you know who's going through financial hardship, please pass it on. Your comments are valued, and subscribing would also be appreciated. Did you know that corporate boardrooms don't just exist at the local business level? We can have our own personal one as well. In the next episode of the God Stories, called God and the Boardroom, you'll see just how real this can be. I'll bet you have one too.